Well, with warnings that we will have stage 8 load shedding this winter and stage 5 pretty much the entire time, the Presidential Climate Commission saying this week they believe it does not make economic sense to keep old coal-fired power stations running past their design life. You'd have seen the Electricity Minister, Newzroom Afrika, and I think the President making comments in this direction recently. Under our climate change commitments, South Africa has said we will shut down these plants as part of the just transition. Steve Nicholls is the head of the mitigation unit at the Presidential Climate Commission. Steve, good evening to you. We've seen this debate around coal-fired power stations. What do you believe we should do?
No, good evening. So I think there's some important context here, and that is the time that it will take to resolve load shedding. If we're still talking about load shedding in 2028, then we have a problem. And so we need to do measures to resolve load shedding in the short term. And so we have no issues with extending coal life, plant life for 1 to 2 years. That's not going to break our emissions commitments and obviously provide some important relief to load shedding. But when you're talking about extending the life of coal plants that are over longer periods, building up to 2030 and post-2030, that then definitely puts our international commitments at risk, which has a whole bunch of additional risks that relate to that, including more challenging raising of capital in international markets, more challenging in trade, particularly with the EU and the UK. And so that starts to have negative or depressive impacts on the economy.
If we use these coal-fired power plants, the ones we're talking about, do we know how much power we would get from them, how reliable they would be?
So the assumption around load factor or energy availability factor is a key assumption when we're thinking about the modeling, and it makes a big difference to what the models produce depending on what you assume. So improving the energy availability factor is a very important thing because that helps build responsiveness into the system. It means we have more options. But you would then manage the load factor to keep within our emissions commitments. The important thing here is more to start building renewables really quickly. So extending the life of a coal plant for 1 or 2 years is potentially an important mitigating factor in the short term, but it shouldn't replace building other generation options. So we really need to focus on building much more renewable energy capacity to start taking up some of that load gap that exists. And renewable energy is the cheapest, quickest and most efficient way to get generation onto the grid. And so really that should be our focus. The cost of the coal plant isn't really that big of a factor if you're dealing in these 1 or 2 year timelines because we have such an energy shortage and because that has such a big impact on the economy.
So as you say, sorry to interrupt. As you say, it makes no sense to switch off a power plant if you don't have generation capacity to replace it with. Even I can work that out. The other thing around that, though, is that you make the point that renewable energy is the quickest to build, and I accept that point. I think that must be true. But don't you also need to build a lot more of it? Because for every 1 megawatt of coal production, you probably need around 3 megawatts of renewable generation capacity, because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. Steve,
yeah, that's correct. So you do need to build more renewable energy generation infrastructure than you would for coal. So that is a key variable. But I should make the point that it's still cheaper to build more that amount of renewables than to build new coal. And so even with taking into account that intermittency factor, it's still cheaper to build coal. You would, though, have to build some supporting infrastructure. So you would need things like peaking turbines to take up the load if you did have an unexpected lull in wind or sun. So yeah, there is more that you have to invest in, and so the recommendations we make about the IRP is to focus on renewable energy and renewable energy rollout, but also to support that infrastructure with battery storage and peaking facilities.
Steve Nicholls, thank you. Head of the mitigation unit at the Presidential Climate Commission.